Good morning. The Committee on Homeland Security Subcommittees on Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection and Transportation and Protective Security will come to order. The subcommittees are meeting today to receive testimony regarding the cybersecurity posture of this nation's aviation sector. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I'm grateful to be holding this hearing this morning with my good friend and chairman of the Transportation and Protective Cybersecurity Security Subcommittee, John Catco. I want to thank him for convening this hearing with me today to examine a topic that I think fits hand in glove with the security of our nation. I have always said that cybersecurity is national security, and there's no better example of that than in the aviation industry. When we think of threats to the industry, traditional avenues of attack are what first come to mind. These threats, like hijackings and bombings, will continue to pose a major security concern moving forward. However, as devices, aircraft, and systems become more interconnected, cybersecurity will increasingly play a larger role in aviation security. That's because nation states, cyber criminals, and hacktivists all possess an incentive to manipulate systems within this sector. Whether it be looking to gain a competitive advantage or financially motivated actions or simply a political statement, the space will always be crowded by malicious actors seeking to do us harm. That's why we need to understand all avenues of attack, to prioritize their severity and to mitigate those vulnerabilities as quickly as we can. Innovation has brought increased efficiencies to daily life, but it has also tied together networks like we have never seen before. Therefore, this is not a single-minded task. We cannot be narrow in our focus. We have to explore the entire aviation ecosystem as a whole. If we have a single weak link anywhere along the chain, then the entire chain can fail. Like earlier this year when we saw a ransomware attack which targeted the city of Atlanta and forced Hartsfield, Jacksonville, Atlanta International Airport to turn off its Wi-Fi services for hours. That's just one of many examples I could give to illustrate the cross-cutting nature of the sector. All of these pose inherent logistical, financial, and security concerns. It therefore becomes incumbent upon the Department of Homeland Security, Congress, and the private sector to work together to find ways to create resilient systems, to create redundancies, to share threat information, and to build safety and trust into systems that have become integral to American travel. Trust is instrumental in the continued health of the aviation industry. Customers and travelers need to have faith in the systems they are using, whether it be from the information on arrival and departure boards to security on the airplanes themselves. Losing the trust of the everyday American would be disastrous for this sector, and gaining it back would be an uphill battle. Fortunately, safety has always been an overriding concern of the aviation industry. The industry has typically and generally risen above all others in this case, as safety has been culturally built into this sector over time. The lessons learned from 9/11 have matured both private sector and federal government entities to the point that they are at today. However, we still need to clearly delineate roles of entities like NPPD, TSA, and the FAA, which we have come to rely upon for our security concerns. We have to build partnerships both within the private sector and within the government. Partnerships like the Aviation Cyber Initiative, which brings together government stakeholders from DHS, DOT, and DOD to tackle cybersecurity problems across the aviation sector. It provides auditing on a voluntary basis to further the goal of a safer, more secure ecosystem. DHS's National Protection and Programs Directorate recently announced the creation of a National Risk Management Center in its effort to enhance risk management integration across the public and private sectors. I'm very interested in the rollout of this center and hope it will become another essential tool for the public-private collaboration based on and focused on cybersecurity. By leveraging existing practices and partnerships already in existence, the aviation industry can maximize security benefits. A 2016 study found that 91% of airlines are planning to invest more in cyber programs over the next 3 years, which is up from only 41% back in 2013, and that is good news. Stakeholders remain poised to tackle the issues at hand and ensure a safe cyber ecosystem within their sector, and it is my hope that organizations like DHS's NPPD are offering support that is beneficial to this sector. In our continued efforts to support and work to support the work and mission space of NPPD, I want to remind my colleagues that late last year, the House passed H.R. 3359, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Act, a bill that is essential to solidifying and strengthening DHS's cybersecurity mission and which would support NPD's efforts to bolster aviation cybersecurity. I'm excited to explore the issue of aviation cybersecurity today. I have faith that all parties will rise to the occasion and ensure that the American people can always have trust in the cybersecurity within the aviation sector. I want to thank the witnesses for their time and for being here today, and I very much look forward to their testimony. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman, the ranking member of the Transportation and Protective Security Subcommittee, for any opening statements she may have.
Thank you very much, Chairman Ratcliffe and Catco, and my fellow ranking member, Mr. Richmond, who will be here for holding today's hearings. Thank you, Mr. Porter, Mr. Troy, and Mr. Stevens, as being our witnesses here today. I am very glad we are holding this hearing because it seems to me that the topic of aviation cybersecurity has not received the attention it demands. Threats to the transportation sector are constantly evolving, and efforts to secure transportation must be beyond simply reacting to the most recent attempted attacks. Next week, we will commemorate the 17th anniversary of the September 11 attacks. One reason terrorists were able to carry out such deadly attacks on that day is that they took us by surprise. The U.S. aviation sector was vulnerable because security efforts had not focused on the possibility of terrorists hijacking a plane and using the plane itself as a missile. In the years since then, we've invested heavily in aviation security by hardening cockpit doors, creating the TSA, improving passenger and baggage screening, and refining intelligence sharing and vetting processes. These efforts have unquestionably made air traffic more secure, but we cannot let our guard down now. We must urge security agencies to think creatively about potential new attack vectors as terrorists continue to search for vulnerabilities to target. With that in mind, we must do more when it comes to the cybersecurity of transportation systems. 17 years after terrorists gain access to cockpits via physical means, we cannot allow them access to cockpits via cyber means. I must have a mouthful of marbles today. Last fall, reports emerged that a research team led by DHS Science and Technology Directorate was able to remotely hack into the systems of a commercial passenger jet. And as a matter of fact, as a part of my briefing, I was informed of 3 additional opportunities that were used to try to hack into systems, even those involving the notorious Russia. In the wrong hands, such a capability could result in mass casualties. Even a much less drastic security breach could have major consequences. The aviation sector relies on a vast network of interconnected systems, including air traffic control, airports, airline operations systems, and reservation and ticketing systems. A cyber attack against any one of these could cause chaos and confusion, resulting in canceled flights, diminished consumer confidence, and enormous costs to the airlines and airports. Despite the clear vulnerabilities and the consequences of a cyber attack with the aviation sector, not much has been done to improve cybersecurity. Although TSA requires your airports and airlines to adopt and implement security programs covering a wide range of measures to protect against attack, TSA does not require these programs to include any cybersecurity measures. Instead, TSA only shares a list of recommended best practices for airports and airlines to implement at their discretion. It is clear that we need the investment on the part of the government in research and development on what to do when we find these intrusions to take place, not just to identify them, categorize them, and share them, but how do we stop them should they become a threat. When it comes to securing air travel, voluntary measures are just not enough. That is why I'm working with my colleagues to develop legislation to require TSA to issue new rules to airports and airlines requiring implementation of baseline security measures, some of which may also apply to surface transportation systems as well. Additionally, while this hearing is focused on the aviation sector, I would be remiss if I didn't note that these issues do indeed affect other modes of transportation as well. Mass transit, passenger rail, freight rail, and pipeline systems all rely on networks that must be secured against cyber attacks. It's my hope that today's hearing will provide us with more information on current cybersecurity efforts within the aviation sector and on what work remains to be done. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for joining us. Thank you, Chairman, for bringing this hearing to us today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Security, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Catco, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Ratcliffe. I'm pleased our subcommittees could work together to hold this timely and obviously very important hearing. In the wake of the devastating attacks on September 11th of 2001, Congress created the Transportation Security Administration to protect and secure our nation's transportation systems. 17 years later, our aviation sector remains a highly attractive target for malicious actors who seek to inflict harm on the United States. However, these threats have proliferated to include the realm of cybersecurity, something that was much less of a concern during the creation of TSA. The travel and tourism industries contribute trillions of dollars to the U.S. and global economy, and passenger volumes have steadily increased year after year. The fact that our aviation system is vital to the vibrancy and interconnectedness of our nation is precisely what makes it such a highly valued target. And make no mistake about it, we are absolutely a highly valued target by the bad guys, and they're constantly trying to probe how to get into our systems and how to attack our airlines. Protecting America's transportation system is a collaborative effort between numerous government and private sector entities who share the goal of protecting the free movement of people and commerce. Therefore, as innovations in technology change the way our aviation sector operates, our collective security posture needs to adapt accordingly. This hearing today will focus on cybersecurity in the aviation domain, and I look forward to discussing how TSA and the Department of Homeland Security in general interact with various stakeholders as partners to bolster the cybersecurity of the aviation system. On any given day, the TSA and its partners in the aviation community secure around 2.4 million travelers, 1.2 million checked bags, and 8.4 million pounds of cargo. These security operations incorporate a wide array of technologies and invoke a considerable number of stakeholders, including airports, airline groups, and air carriers, among many others. As the aviation community increasingly relies on connected systems for critical operations, we must acknowledge the urgency and importance of protecting the aviation sector's information technology systems and data against cyber threats. The impact of cyber attacks can be far-reaching. In addition to significant security consequences, cyber attacks on the aviation sector can prompt considerable economic loss, passenger frustration, and undermine the public's trust in the aviation system. As chairman of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Security, I've been a very vocal advocate for forward-leaning security policies and best practices to safeguard our nation's transportation systems. And I believe we need to start thinking about cybersecurity as a critical element of that overall security posture. That is why I'm pleased to hold the hearing this morning with my colleagues from the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection. Our discussions surrounding aviation security should not ignore the vulnerabilities and risks posed by broad and interconnected systems with multiple vectors of attack. As our systems in the air and on the ground become more advanced and more interconnected, cybersecurity will continue to be inextricably linked with aviation security. TSA was created in the aftermath of 9/11 and charged with the mission of preventing another large-scale attack of terrorism on the American transportation system. While physical threats like improvised explosive devices continue to pose a major security concern, the reality is that U.S. networks and databases are under daily cyber threat by nation states, international crime organizations, and individual hackers. Now, we need to pause for a second and really think about what this all means. Cyber threats can manifest themselves in many different ways. They could paralyze our systems and shut down the system. They could affect things such as site access or access controls to secure areas, allowing people to get into secure areas who shouldn't be there. And we know from recent incidences in Dallas-Fort Worth and elsewhere, enough criminal conduct goes on with people who have site access. Imagine what could happen if we have people who don't and can get into those areas. Airplane security, of course, is a big one. But let's not forget what was reported last year in 2017, where a report surfaced that Homeland Security was able to hack into a Boeing 757 that was sitting on the tarmac. Now, some people have harpooned various aspects of that report, but the specter remains that a plane could actually technically be weaponized against us and be taken over by bad guys through cybersecurity threats. That is something we need to talk about today and something we need to talk about tomorrow and all the way through. And as Ms. Watson-Coleman alluded to as well, same holds true for the aviation or for the transportation sector in trains, taking over a train and weaponizing a train. That is a new threat. It's a new frontier. And our military has recognized this threat to such an extent that they have a cyber command. And I'm concerned that we may not be having the same priorities bestowed upon TSA and Homeland Security, and we have to understand the threat is real and it's going to keep getting worse. This hearing illustrates my commitment to bringing a necessary focus to cybersecurity in the aviation sector, and I look forward to learning about the federal government's role in this space from our esteemed witnesses. I hope to understand how the partnerships between the Department of Homeland Security, TSA, and aviation stakeholders can be leveraged to make cyber risk awareness a key part of aviation security. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Thank the gentleman. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a very distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic. Mr. Christopher Porter is the Chief Intelligence Strategist for Fireeye, as well as a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Previously, he had a distinguished 9-year career in the Central Intelligence Agency working on cybersecurity issues. Welcome, Mr. Porter. Mr. Jeffrey Troy is the Executive Director of the Aviation Information Sharing and Analysis Center and currently works as a Senior IT Manager at General Electric. Prior to this, Mr. Troy served for 25 years in the FBI, including his final stint as Deputy Assistant Director of the Cyber Division. We're grateful to have you here testifying today, Mr. Troy. And finally, Mr. Michael Stevens is the Executive Vice President for IT and General Counsel at the Tampa International Airport, where he has primary responsibility for all legal, information technology, governance, regulatory, and compliance matters. Welcome, Mr. Stevens. We're excited to hear your testimony as well. I'd now ask the witnesses to please stand, if able, and raise your right hand so that I can swear you in to testify. Do each of you swear or affirm that the testimony which you will give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that each of the witnesses has answered in the affirmative, and you may be seated. The witnesses' full written statements will appear in the record. The chair now recognizes Mr. Porter for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Richmond, Chairman Catco, and Ranking Member Coleman for convening this joint hearing today. We appreciate the opportunity to share Fireeye's perspective on threats to the aviation sector and provide an overview of how we are helping to secure American aviation. As was mentioned, my name is Christopher Porter. I'm the Chief Intelligence Strategist at Fireeye. Our strategic intelligence products that inform my testimony today reach over 4,000 customers in 67 countries. Prior to joining Fireeye, I worked at CIA for almost 9 years. That included not only work at the agency, but also a short stint as the briefer at the White House for cyber threat intelligence issues, several years in counterterrorism operations, and war zone service as well. I want to share with you today Fireeye's perspective, which is mostly informed responding to breaches in the aviation sector, but also the intelligence that we've collected on what might be coming next to try to get ahead of the problem. I'm sure it will come as no surprise to the members of these two subcommittees that the aviation sector is one of the most targeted for cyber attack that our company sees. Safe, reliable air transport is vital for everything from national defense to global commerce to personal freedom. Malicious actors seeking to undermine America's strength in aviation through cyber attacks and through theft of data include foreign governments, terrorists, organized crime, and non-state actors acting on their own. I want to start by discussing the most common cyber threat that the aviation industry faces, which is cyber espionage. Foreign governments routinely seek to steal industrial secrets from American manufacturers, researchers, designers, operators of military aircraft, and cutting-edge civilian planes. It's about who you would expect. China, Russia, more recently Iran have all targeted the U.S. or, in some cases, our close allies who we share technology with overseas to try and steal aviation secrets via computer network operations. All three countries also routinely target ticketing and traveler data, shipping schedules and manifests, and partner industries such as railways and hotels, mostly for domestic security reasons. There are two aspects of cyber espionage, though, that I want to focus on. The first is that because it's a pervasive threat, the best defense against cyber espionage is rapid, detailed information sharing with context. Our company pushes alerts to customers in real time when possible. The technical alerts are in real time. We try to provide context within 24 to 48 hours. Industry groups share information between peers because, as we've all learned, a threat to one is usually a threat to all. The U.S. government also shares its threat information, although it's generally classified and only available to cleared vendors. There is room for improvement at the speed of dissemination of intelligence, mostly from collector to agencies like DHS that then share it. Most importantly, the timeliness of information within industry and between the private sector and the U.S. government must improve. So it's not just the government that has work to do. The second thing to know about cyber espionage, though, is that because it is routine, any one individual activity should not be viewed as destabilizing, to the whole nation. Media reporting on cyber incidents is naturally going to focus on the worst case scenario of what could happen. Sometimes that's justified, oftentimes it's not. And the public should not be needlessly alarmed or lose their confidence in what is generally a very safe industry because of individual cyber espionage incidents. Every major cyber power, including the United States, has an interest in knowing about the potential defense technology developments of both its friends and potential threats, and the U.S. aviation sector isn't the only one that's being targeted in this way. So while espionage on its own does not pose an urgent threat to life, I am concerned that continued theft of trade secrets could pose a long-term threat to American economic health. Aviation is one of our nation's leading export industries. China in particular is harnessing all aspects of national power to displace the U.S. as a military and economic power. Chinese theft of intellectual property for commercial purposes has almost entirely dropped off since the September 2015 agreement between President Xi of China and President Obama. Diplomacy does work as a cybersecurity means. However, that depends a lot on what industry you're in. And for the aviation sector, research and development is so closely tied to national defense that it really never stopped being targeted. So that, unfortunately, the matter before these committees is not defended by those diplomatic efforts. They continue. Cyber criminals likewise pose an economic threat to the aviation sector and its customers. For years, we've seen airlines and third-party ticket sellers exploited so that illicit tickets could be resold for profit in underground fora. In the last 2 years, our devices have detected a sharp increase in the use of ransomware to temporarily disable airline ticketing and support operations. That's often untargeted, not specifically aimed at airports, but as we've seen, it could be as well. Air travel is a time-sensitive business. Cybercriminals know they can extort payment from airlines that are unable to move passengers until their systems are decrypted. Finally, in addition to threats to the aviation sector's proprietary information, customer records, and systems that support flight operations, there are cyber threats that are intended to use aviation's prominent place in our lives as a means of creating psychological damage when it's affected. Airports in Europe, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and to a limited extent here at home have had their websites defaced or disrupted in order to draw attention to political causes. The primary victim in those situations are members of the public who may wrongly fear that a loved one is at risk or grow in their distrust of flying, even though the affected systems are public relations focused or don't support flight operations. So it is important that officials and airline representatives communicating with the public during such events differentiate between systems that are affected where if you take them down it just causes inconvenience or reputational damage versus systems that if they're targeted or damaged directly support flight operations and could affect passenger safety. So thank you again for the opportunity to participate in today's discussion, and I thank you for your leadership improving cybersecurity in the aviation sector. I look forward to working with you to strengthen our partnership, and I'm happy to answer any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Porter. The chair now recognizes Mr. Troy for his opening statement.
Good morning. My name is Jeffrey Troy. I'm the Executive Director of the Aviation Information Sharing and Analysis Center. The Aviation ISAC is a global, member-driven nonprofit company. Our member companies are headquartered on 5 continents and represent a cross-section of the many businesses that make up the aviation ecosystem. They include the makers of aircrafts, their engines, airlines, airports, satellite communication providers, and aviation services, as well as their supply chains. The mission of the Aviation ISAC is to increase the cyber resiliency of the aviation sector across the world. Safety comes first in every aspect of the aviation industry, and cybersecurity is no exception. Each segment of our industry has numerous automated computer-based processes which contribute to the overall safety and efficiency of aviation. Each member of the Aviation ISAC has a Chief Information Security Officer or someone comparable who assumes the responsibility of protecting the computer networks and products that are performing the operations of the business and protecting them from cyber attack. The Aviation ISAC works with each CISO to understand their company's risk profile, and we use this information to drive industry programs and to reduce cyber risk. The Aviation ISAC builds communities of experts within each of the specialties supporting the CISO. These include cyber threat analysts, compliance experts, network security architects, and product security specialists. Each community leverages the combined capabilities of members to expedite the development of solutions and intelligence to either reduce or eliminate risk. We facilitate automated and in-person intelligence exchange, training, best practices, and tabletop exercises. We proactively hunt for threats, stolen network access, indicators of compromise, and we engage with security researchers. Our focus is on finding information that can be used by the aviation industry to reduce cyber risk and increase operational resilience. Every business and every industry, including aviation, can only succeed when the needs and the concerns of their customers are met, and this includes addressing misperceptions. Flying is the safest mode of transportation. However, there have been times over the past few years when persons incorrectly allege they were able to impact the safety of flight by hacking a system on a plane. The Aviation ISAC has addressed these issues head-on. Working with industry and coordinating with government partners, we play a leading role in investigating alleged vulnerabilities and conducting extensive testing to ferret out any vulnerabilities, validated or invalidated. The Aviation ISAC recognizes the value of the work of cybersecurity researchers in finding these vulnerabilities, even if the vulnerabilities are minor, contained, and do not pose a risk to flight safety. The aviation industry will continue to investigate vulnerability claims and take swift action when required. As of today, none of the vulnerabilities that have been investigated by the Aviation ISAC or its members have impacted the safety of flight. The Aviation ISAC is also pleased to have a strong and productive relationship with our government partners. Indeed, liaison with government was part of the founding idea of the Aviation ISAC. We collaborate in many forms and on a wide scope of aviation, cybersecurity-related projects. For example, in a recent engagement with a threat researcher who sensationalized the claim of being able to hack a plane, we kept both our industry members and government partners well apprised of our work to include the sharing of technical details. We engaged with the Department of Homeland Security, Transportation Security Administration, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the European Aviation Safety Agency. The aviation industry, like all industries with extensive digital integration, has not declared victory, but rather is constantly engaged in the battle. As I said earlier, in aviation, security and safety comes first. Digital enhancements to processes are adopted at a deliberate pace to ensure that there's no impact to safety. Security around the digital processes begins in the design stages and runs through the build, deploy, operate, and continuously monitor phases. Airframers and their suppliers extensively test new technologies and design layered safety and security controls, both digital and physical, to ensure the highest level of safety in flight. We do not know what we do not know. Many vulnerabilities in computer systems were discovered years after the systems were designed and deployed, and new technologies are being added to existing platforms. As such, our industry is constantly red teaming their systems and seeking to uncover issues before they become impactful. We believe safety and security are significantly enhanced when companies and government agencies communicate on cyber threats and vulnerabilities. On behalf of all of our members, I thank you for the opportunity to come before you today and answer questions about cybersecurity and cyber resilience in the aviation industry.
Thank you, Mr. Troy. The chair now recognizes Mr. Stevens for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Ratcliffe, Chairman Catco, to Ranking Member Richmond, Ranking Member Watson Coleman, and members of the subcommittee, good morning. My name is Michael Stevens. I'm the Executive Vice President and General Counsel for Information Technology for Tampa International Airport, and we thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing on the critically important topic of understanding and mitigating cybersecurity threats to our nation's airlines, airports, and our critical aviation infrastructure. More than 2.5 million passengers travel safely in and out of America's airports each and every day. The largest 5 U.S. airports alone move more passengers through them on an annual basis than the entire population of the United States. Our airports facilitated the shipment of more than 40 billion pounds of cargo. In total, the aviation sector contributes approximately 5.1% to our national GDP. Aviation is essential not only to our economic prosperity, but to our national security interests as well. In order to meet the increasing demand and the needs of international commerce and the traveling public, virtually all of the essential airport operations and functions, as well as aviation safety, security, access control, navigations, communications, industrial systems controls, and emergency response systems must rely heavily on a multitude of technology applications and platforms. For that reason, it is my opinion, like the other witnesses here, that cybersecurity risks, without question, represent the most preeminent and persistent threat to the continuous, safe, secure, and efficient operations of U.S. airports in the global aviation system. Airports and airlines defend against hundreds of thousands of malicious intrusion attempts each and every day. In short, computers, kiosks, and keyboards have become the newest tools of criminals and the new weapons of war. And it is of paramount importance that we exercise increased urgency and vigilance to mitigate cybersecurity threats to our nation's critical aviation infrastructure. And while there is no silver bullet or perfect defense against cybersecurity threats within the aviation industry, there are some critical areas that I believe present great opportunities for airports, along with our airline partners and aviation stakeholders, to achieve greater preparedness, responsiveness, and resilience. First, the adoption of a standard. Although airports and airlines and other aviation stakeholders have engaged in building and achieving levels of cybersecurity capability, maturity, and resilience, there are currently no minimum standards or frameworks being used across the sector. In fact, according to a survey of U.S. airports by the Airport Cooperative Research Program in its guidebook on best practices for airport cybersecurity, only 9 out of 24, or 34%, of airport respondents indicated that they had implemented a national cybersecurity standard or framework. I believe significant consideration should be given by airports and airlines to mandate within their respective organizations the adoption and implementation of established cybersecurity standards and frameworks. A second opportunity is what the witnesses who are joining me here today have talked about, and that's the increased sharing of information and threat intelligence, because it's a critical component for airports to assess our vulnerabilities and to enhance our preparedness and more effectively respond and recover in the event of a critical cyber incident. It is essential that we strengthen information sharing, and consideration should be given to more proactive and broader disclosure within the sector by airports and airlines of cybersecurity incidents that meet an agreed-upon threshold, irrespective of whether or not the incident resulted in a data breach or system compromise. And finally, the human factor. The human factor remains the most highly exploited vector for penetrating cybersecurity defenses. Cybersecurity threat awareness and information security training programs for all airports, airline, and aviation sector employees is perhaps the most effective and cost-efficient way of increasing airport and airline cybersecurity readiness. Airports and airlines should be given strong consideration to adopting uniform standards which establish baseline training requirements for airport, airline, and other key aviation sectors employees on a defined and recurring basis. As the adoption of current and future technologies increases to support the aviation sector, the threat of disruptive cyber attacks on airports, airlines, and critical aviation information sector systems undoubtedly will increase as well. Evolution toward a more effective cyber risk management mitigation strategy by airports, key aviation sector stakeholders through the adoption and implementation of baseline cybersecurity and frameworks and standards is absolutely essential to the nation's security and long-term prosperity. Again, I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you all today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. We'll now move into the questioning portion of our hearing, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Porter, I want to start with you. Fireeye has been very vocal about APT 33 and its links to the Iranian government. APT 33 has targeted, among other things, Middle Eastern carriers and airports and utilities. So I want your perspective on how Iran is using cybersecurity as a geopolitical tool, and more specifically, how does, if you can sort of get into how breaching the airlines and airports of its neighboring countries furthers the geopolitical goals of the Iranian regime.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The perspective that I have on what Iran and all the other major antagonists of the U.S. and its allies, they basically are all engaged in the same class of activity, which is, for the most part, they're looking at domestic security, so looking at traveler movements and that sort of thing. So for them, it's probably viewed mostly as a domestic security issue, looking at what's going on in the region. It is, however, also an opportunity for them to look at what the U.S. is doing with its partners, intelligence gathering in support of military operations or in support of their own technological and economic development. So I think for them, they would view it as it naturally being in their backyard to look at this from a security perspective, not necessarily, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, not necessarily an attack. The thing to keep in mind, though, Mr. Chairman, is that any foothold that any adversary gets into a system that's used for cyber espionage, which is widespread and everyone does it, that can easily be turned into an attack. That same foothold can be used and turned, depending on the willingness of the aggressor, as an attack vector. And by attack, I mean disabling the computer system, not necessarily causing kinetic action against an airplane. But the primary restraint is not technological. It's going to be the willingness of the actor to do that.
Terrific. I want to ask you a little more broad question. As innovation in technology widens the attack surface, I'm wondering how Fireeye is spending its time these days in terms of what is the most frequent, most likely venue of attack with respect to the aviation sector.
Sure, thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. If I were looking at it from an adversary's perspective, I think the real weakness of the aviation sector isn't going to be something like the airplanes themselves, which have a lot of resilience, and the class of actors that could bake in a destructive capability against an airplane by cyber means also have other means of disabling airplanes. So what I'm primarily concerned about is reputational damage. Could you go out and make people think that airplanes are unsafe? Could you hack websites and then create the perception that it's no longer safe in the region? That could cause massive economic damage that a CISO sitting at an airport or an airline or a manufacturer would have a hard time defending themselves against, because they're not really the direct target. It's this system of interconnected computers, some of which may not even be under their physical control. It could be a third-party system that's compromised and used to draw attention to what alleged safety deficiencies. I would also say, secondarily, I'm concerned that some of actors that are capable of causing kinetic loss of airplanes through traditional conventional means might claim that downing an airplane was the result of a hacker. In other words, there is no actual cyber threat, but the feasibility of it could be used to explain a loss by other means. So I think you could see that coming as well. And that's why it's important to keep the public, I think, just the right amount of scared, enough to want to invest in defense and resilience especially, but not necessarily assuming that every case of cyber espionage is leading to an attack, because that's another way of interpreting my remarks, is that if cyber espionage is pervasive and there's no attacks happening, that would imply that the willingness to do so isn't there at this time, and people should keep that in mind as well.
Want to move to you, Mr. Troy. The transportation sector, and of course within that the aviation industry, has two sector-specific agencies that they have to work with in the Department of Transportation and the Department of Homeland Security. As I referenced in my opening statement, TSA, NPPD, FAA, they all have equities in this space. I want your perspective from the ISAC perspective, I guess, with regard to what I mentioned in terms of how well those entities are sort of playing with one another in that space, and whether or not there needs to be greater clarity with respect to their roles or issues that we need to be aware of in addressing.
So the Aviation ISAC, we have a lot of touch points with each of those agencies. When the government set up each of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, they created the government coordinating committees, and on the industrial side, the sector coordinating committees for each of the sectors. So the Aviation ISAC is a part of the Aviation Sector Coordinating Committee, and through that, we meet regularly with each of those different agencies and work on the highest priority projects for protecting the sector. Separately, we have a person that is on the floor of the NKIC inside of NPPD, and we have a person who's daily at the ADIAC, the Air Domain Intelligence Analysis Cell, which is run by the TSA, and we have routine engagement with the FAA. So I would characterize each agency as very much understanding what their different roles are, and through those and other forms that they are protecting, are working well in terms of efforts to protect the sector. I would like to also recognize that NPD's movement towards this risk management center, I think, is a very good move to see, because I think risk management frameworks, which were mentioned also by Mr. Stevens, are a critical part of the process in terms of maturing the cybersecurity capability of each of the segments inside the industry.
Thank you. My time has expired. Recognize the gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you for the information you've shared with us today. Mr. Stevens, I want to start with you. You represent an airport. Are airports currently required to include any cybersecurity measures in their plans?
Congresswoman Watson-Coleman, thank you for that question. At this time, there is no absolute requirement to do so. The governing regulations 49 CFR Part 1540, which is administered primarily by the TSA, has primarily been focused on physical security, access to the sterile airside areas, making sure SIDA badges are checked, all of those types of things. But as all of you have pointed out correctly, the cybersecurity element has penetrated the domain of the physical security element, and yet that similar type of posture hasn't been moved over to address a baseline standard on the cybersecurity side for airports.
Thank you. So if you're not aware, then I'm pretty certain that you gentlemen, Mr. Porter, Mr. Troy, aren't aware of any required standards either.
No, I'm not.
Thank you. Mr. Stevens, you indicated three things that I thought were really important: the adoption of standards, the increased sharing of information and threat analysis, and the human factor of baseline training.
Yes, ma'am.
What do you believe is the role of the DHS and the TSA in each of those things, and is this a matter of additional resources, or prioritization?
Well, again, that's a great question. Resources are always an issue, but I think that prioritization is one of the critical areas that we have to focus on. Again, there are fantastic standards out there, DHS and the federal government implementing the NIST standard is an excellent standard out there, except that there hasn't been broad and widespread use of those standards in the aviation sector, particularly with respect to airports. DHS, for example, offers cybersecurity and Wi-Fi testing. We've used and taken advantage of it at Tampa International, and it's been a great tool. So there are tools out there. I think there has to be a more aggressive posture with airports and the airline industry and actually leveraging and using those tools. And yes, that may be a function of resources. I know DHS is tasked heavily just trying to implement the requirements of the statute on the federal side. So there's an issue there. But then secondly, the training element is important. I do believe that there may be some room for at least having airports adopt a baseline standard. Again, as we like to say in our industry, you've seen one airport, because they're governed very differently, their structures are set up very differently. But having the notion of a baseline cybersecurity standard, I think, goes a long way.
So, gentlemen, I'm very concerned about land transportation, airport, train stations, freight, all those things, buses. Do you believe that what we could develop to be more proactive and represent greater protection in cybersecurity threats in the aviation industry can also be applied to ground transportation systems?
I'd like to maybe start on that, because before I became the General Counsel and CIO for the Aviation Authority, I was with Surface Transportation, our equivalent of DC Metro. And the exact same risks are out there when you look at things like automated train control, when you look at signalization, when you look at signalization and priority and all of our crossing points. So the exact same risks exist. I think that the difference to a certain extent, and this may be anecdotal, there is a more pervasive feeling from the traveling public when you think about catastrophic attacks or disruptions in airports. I mean, if you look at Atlanta, what happened with a fire incident that was not related to cybersecurity, you're talking about passengers being stranded on airplanes and in terminals for hours, $40 million worth of direct value lost. But the exact same threats exist on the surface transportation side, absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Troy. Mr. Porter, you might give a comment on that?
I would agree with that statement that there are systems that have common functions in terms of helping to move the industry. As we move towards smart cities and more of the controls, again, are automated, they run that risk that those industrial security control tools, which are common across the industries, could be under attack.
Thank you.
Yeah, and leaving aside discussion of the attack surface, the shared technology, I think the same sort of adversaries that would be interested in disrupting one would be interested in disrupting the other, and we do see that they use the same infrastructure to attack both, so information sharing would help both, particularly for, I think for military logistics, for example. You've got a long train, no pun intended, between the U.S. and wherever soldiers are deploying, and for their equipment, it's going to go over a variety of methods, individual mom and pop trucking companies, trains, air freight, and it may eventually end up in a naval port loading onto a Navy ship. So if you can disrupt any one of those, even if it's civilian owned and controlled, you can disrupt a deployment ability. So certainly I would agree that it's valuable to pursue.
Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes a gentleman from New York, Chairman Catco.
Thank you,
5
Mr.
minutes.
Chairman. I appreciate all of your testimony here today. I just want to circle back to for a moment back to my opening statement and some of the things I noted in there about how systems can be paralyzed and the concern with side access, as well as airplane and rail security itself. Mr. Porter, you kind of alluded that you didn't think it's as likely to have an attack on a cyber attack on a rail or airplane that could basically weaponize it. Is that accurately portraying what you said?
I don't want to get too much into the specifics and mislead you about my expertise. I can't. I would defer, I think, to the DHS study on the feasibility. I just think it's much more likely that the reputational damage scenarios are much more likely to occur. However, I did note in your opening remarks, and I certainly would agree, Mr. Chairman, that the sort of nightmare scenarios where a plane or something like that is weaponized probably involves someone getting physical access. I think that opens up a whole different world of opportunities for cyber attacks. So to minimize the chance of that happening, certainly physical controls are going to be, arguably, from my perspective, one of the most important ways of addressing that particular concern. As others on the panel have pointed out, you never know what you don't know, and a dedicated adversary could, of course, research a very specific vulnerability, but even then it might require physical access, and I think that's a great thing for us to focus on defensively.
Yeah, and that kind of gets my point. These threats are real, and we're talking about things kind of at the 30,000-foot level, but let's face it. I mean, the threats we have, since I've been a congressman, I've had my stuff hacked. Somebody tried to open up accounts for me in my name and on the West Coast, bank accounts. That was a direct result of my government records being hacked. So I don't think there's many people in this room who haven't had some sort of a cyber attack perpetrated upon them. So to think of the vulnerabilities that are at these airports and the ones I spoke about, to name a few, and the access controls is a huge issue for me too. And then to hear what Mr. Stevens said, which was shocking to me, was that on a survey of the 24 airports, whatever it was, less than a third said they've implemented any sort of cybersecurity strategy that's in line with what you're thinking. That's frightening to me. That is absolutely ridiculous that we countenance that. So to all of you, I want to hear what you think we should be doing to address that.
Chairman, I think one of the first areas is a greater insistence and urgency that maybe just falls very short of the notion of wholesale regulation, but to make sure that airports, when we do our security checks, when TSA comes to check under their governing provisions, and when FAA checks for airfield security, that there is some consideration of checking to see if an airport at least has a basic cybersecurity protocol in place to identify, react, respond.
Can I interrupt? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm short on time, and I do want to make sure I get this. Do I understand you correctly? When they come and do airport assessments, they don't assess the cyber vulnerabilities of the airports?
They don't assess the cyber vulnerabilities of the airports. That's correct.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think we can do a better job, as I said, across the sector. Right now, airports, airlines, and all of the aviation sector components have a vested interest in doing it. We want to protect the traveling public, and so we go above and beyond. And I would say that we're not the only ones. Across the industry, we do a good job. But if we're talking about partnering and making sure that there are clear command controls and communications between government and the oversight agencies, as well as the airports and the sector key components, then there needs to be a more urgent need to adopt some of those standards.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Mr. Troy, Mr. Porter, you want to add anything to that?
Mr. Stevens, I think I agree with his statements, and he's well positioned with his background, I think, to make those best observations.
Okay, Mr. Porter?
Yeah, I would agree, and also in deferring to Mr. Stevens, I think from other sectors, having those standards certainly does have an impact and raises the bar. It did in the finance sector. I think there's reason to think that it would in aviation as well. For me, I want to make sure that any standards that are put in place not only focus on security but resilience. Can the airport operate without internet access for a short period of time? Can people still do some basic level of operation? There'll be some disruption no matter what, but I think that's an area that across all sectors, we are falling behind on, is the opportunity to make sure that operations aren't totally disrupted when the internet or an internet-connected device is brought down. As long as we are held hostage by our technological and economic success, that's going to be a vulnerability, a strategic vulnerability for us as a nation.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, just one quick second on a follow-up with Mr. Stevens. You're at Tampa Airport, correct? And that's where you have your cyber systems and that you oversee, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. Why in God's name wouldn't the other airports be doing the same thing?
Well, Chairman, I don't want to go as far as to say other airports aren't. I'm sure that they are. But as I said in my written remarks, because of the governance structures in airports, So for example, the largest airport, busiest airport in the world, Hartsfield-Jackson, that was referenced earlier, it's a subset of the city of Tampa, just like water and sewage, of city of Atlanta, just like water and sewage. Tampa International is an independent aviation authority, so we have more agility in implementing certain things. Another one, Chicago O'Hare, a subset of the city of Chicago. And so when you look at it from that standpoint, airports are definitely doing things. I think they recognize the value for all the reasons that the other witnesses have mentioned. It's just that there is not necessarily a level of consistency. And as I pointed out, when that survey was conducted, only 34% had a baseline standard, and we have to do better as an industry.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all your testimony.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chair now recognizes gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to each of you, and thank you so much for being here with us today. Mr. Stevens, I welcome you from my home state of Florida. As we all know, September 11th was one of the darkest days in American history. On that very dreadful day, I was assigned as a police commander to the Orlando International Airport. And there is no doubt since that time we have really come a long way in terms of ensuring the safety of the traveling public. But it does appear, and I'm more convinced now than ever just listening to your testimony this morning, that the area of cybersecurity still appears to be or continues to be somewhat of a mystery. And we still have much work to do. I remember a long time ago as a law enforcement officer, we were told that you cannot fight today's battles with yesterday's weapons. And as we've talked about, some physical things that we have certainly kept up with to ensure the safety of our airports, cybersecurity, it just does not appear that we are quite there yet. But I am sure we will get there. Mr. Troy, you were quoted recently in Bloomberg commenting on DHS and the FBI reports that Russian hackers attacked some aviation sector companies during assaults on U.S. critical infrastructure in 2017. In your view, have reports about state-sponsored attacks on aviation systems had a measurable impact on the way aviation sector executives view cybersecurity?
Yes, we have seen that the information that we've been able to share with the government partners and amongst our member companies has absolutely driven them to up their game with respect to their cybersecurity programs, and in some instances actually reprioritize certain projects they were working on.
I've also heard each of you talk about the importance of information sharing, and I know that there have been or continues to be some issues, especially between the public and private sector. I've heard some say that the private sector is more willing to share information, but then the public sector are not so much. And so I would just like to hear from each of you, or perhaps Mr. Stevens or Mr. Troy, about what role do you think that DHS or the TSA can play in improving the information sharing or being more proactive in that area?
So, Congresswoman Demings, I would start by saying that some of the information sharing that happens now, while it's good, sometimes it's not as fresh as we would like the information. Sometimes it's post facto. So I think they certainly can be more proactive. There are certainly DHS resources that allow for information sharing, AIS, which is the automated indicator sharing system. But again, those tools are out there, but how broadly disseminated they are to airports and to key aviation sector members is going to demonstrate the adoption of them and what their utility is going to be. We actively look out there to see what tools are available, and the resources that are out there from DHS, we actively try to get everything that we can where we can. But I think there has to be more proactive real-time sharing of information. And finally, I would say one of the things that we're doing, for example, at Tampa International, in fact, today it's happening, our regional security director with TSA and our planning and development folks are meeting to look at how we can create our own threat fusion center, where we have the Airport Operations Center, CBP, TSA, other tenant agencies, all co-located in one place. In many airports, based on the structure, they're just simply not. Someone may be in discrete locations on the airport, or maybe not even at the airport altogether. And so I think more creative efforts to look at how we can break down those barriers to enhance information sharing is going to be critical to success.
Mr. Troy, anything to add to that?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, I really like seeing DHS move into this risk management center. That really shows a strategic shift, which we think is critically important. The sharing of information is only valuable when you're sharing information that's of value. And that is one of the concerns that we have. We just don't want noise where the lots of indicators and information moving across everybody and saying, wow, look, we're all sharing, this is great. What we're looking for is kind of a process that we use in the aviation ISAC called risk registers, where we're actually looking to see what is really the biggest risks that you're worried about, and where is there information that can help reduce those risks and close up those particular gaps. So as Mr. Stevens mentioned, for example, there's many airports, and I agree with the statement, there are many airports that really don't have a cybersecurity plan yet. It's difficult to understand how you can help someone who's not sure what their plan is. So this process of helping people get their plans into place and then being able to use that information to develop the requirements for the types of information that can help them.
Thank you. Mr. Porter, very quickly, anything to add?
Sure. Nothing specifically on current information sharing programs. I think it's just worth the subcommittees considering and keeping in mind that the front line in the fight is going to be the private sector. And I think if that were the guiding principle for executive branch information sharing, it would be very different. I think oftentimes it's viewed as an addendum to core responsibilities and not actually a core responsibility. But the fight is in overwhelmingly the private sector, private individuals, private companies, privately owned infrastructure. So.
Thank you so much, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank
Thank
you.
you, gentlelady. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Donovan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And being from New York, Mr. Stevens, I welcome you too, because all my voters actually moved down to you. Mr. Porter, you made a great distinction between attacks that may inconvenience our travelers, whether it's the ticketing system going down, versus the things that might be dangerous or harmful to passengers. We had seen examples of someone with a laptop taking over one of these autonomous vehicles, driverless vehicles. Is that possible with an aircraft?
That's not research that our company pursues independently, so I would have to defer to the aircraft manufacturers and the DHS report. I find the concern certainly credible enough that when our customers ask, we say that it's a credible threat, but we generally refer that to specialists at the manufacturers or at DHS and others who have done the studies.
I see. Mr. Troy, Ms. Stevens, do you have a comment on that?
So our members have not seen a credible report that's come in to them regarding the ability to hack a plane in a way that affects systems critical to flight. And in my statement, I also said we don't know what we don't know. Yeah. So the continuous monitoring, the continuous red teaming, and the continuous process of safety integration of new systems constantly goes on in our industry to prevent that type of an attack from occurring.
Congressman, I would agree with my fellow witnesses from an aircraft perspective, but what I would offer is the perspective, I used to be a former air traffic controller in the U.S. Air Force, and what I would offer is the perspective of industrial controls for our nav aids. I think that there are vulnerabilities potentially there if you look at some of the studies, particularly as the FAA looks to moving towards next gen, right? There is the ability potentially to spoof, global positioning information systems. So there lies and exists a potential threat, whether we're talking about specifically on the aircraft, but certainly as the aircraft is approaching the surface where it needs to be able to land. We need to make sure that the same type of cybersecurity protections are in place for all of our nav aids and all of our airport safety devices. So that, from my perspective, that's where I think there is a particular more credible threat.
Right, yeah, you must be reading my notes. My next question was about the air traffic control system and someone compromising that while we have aircraft in the aircraft landing, aircraft trying to take off, and the dangers that would pose. It's one issue if this happens when every aircraft is on the ground, but I forget how many aircraft were in the air that fateful day that Ms. Demons spoke about that we had to put down on the ground. And if that system was compromised, how dangerous that would be. This may piggyback on my first question and may be out of your realm, but in many of the things that we speak about on Homeland Security Committee, we talk about component parts. And the compromising component parts as something is put together elsewhere, whether our aircraft is built outside the United States or whether they're built here, but we have component parts coming in from outside. And if a compromised component part is built into the making of that aircraft, how dangerous that could be. Are there measures in place to assure us that component parts would not jeopardize the aircraft while it's being made?
Yeah, so our industry, again, is incredibly focused on safety, and even in the example of the information coming in through an air traffic control system, that's a single point of information coming into the cockpit. And the systems are not designed to rely on one piece of information or one source of information. They're built in redundant ways in order to make sure that if a system did fail, there are ways to validate whether or not that system has failed, and then other systems are in place to be able to leverage in those instances. That same process is also used with respect to the supply chain, so equipment is tested extensively as it is put into each of the products. And, you know, our products in the industry are much more than just the plane. I mean, there's many other products there. With the plane, again, very high risk with anything that could impact critical flight. So there's going to be more of I'd say more of a prioritization and more emphasis on those processes and that equipment.
I thank you all. Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our witnesses this morning and thank you for your testimony. I think it's a very important hearing on an important topic. So I was encouraged by the line of questioning and the answers on that Ms. Demings had raised about information sharing. It's when we passed the CISA law in 2015, it was with the hope that we were going to bring down those legal barriers that existed that were supposedly preventing robust threat indicator sharing information from happening. And unfortunately, now, it's 2 or 3 years later, we haven't. I don't think that CISA has really yet lived up to what our hopes and expectations would be on info sharing. To date, there's only about 200 or so companies that are downloading information from DHS that the government is offering, and there's only about 6 or 7 companies that are actually sharing threat information back with the to DHS. So I find that troubling, and obviously in an ideal world, we had robust information sharing of threat indicators. We had perfect situational awareness. We're going to go a long way toward better protecting our networks. Mr. Troy, let me ask you, again, I was encouraged by your testimony affirming the value of companies and government agencies sharing information about cyber threats. So how active are the Aviation ISAC and your sector's members in DHS's automated indicator sharing program, and is the airline industry sharing cyber incident data with DHS?
So we have shared information with DHS numerous times over the past years that we are aware of, that the government actually turned it into an intelligence information report in the government and shared that information amongst the government. We are proactively sharing with them, as I mentioned, information that we think is of value. The Aviation ISAC itself is not involved in the automated indicator sharing program. However, we have some members who I believe are involved in that program with DHS. As again, I mentioned, our focus is really trying to stay away from noise and be focused on key information that's critical.
Why do you think it is that more in the airline industry aren't more proactively engaged with DHS in the AI system? What do you see as barriers? I understand you talked about not just sharing noise, but context. But what other things could we be doing to incentivize or ensure that more information sharing is actually going to happen from the airline industry?
Well, I think that the information that is of most value is getting shared. When information comes in, the way the Aviation ISAC works is that each member owns their data. So we ask them if they're willing to share this information beyond membership. We frequently get that thumbs up from our members and are able to share that information with the government. The Aviation ISAC also has a person who reports daily to the NCIC and has access to our information, is able to have those conversations going on with respect to that information. So I think that the key pieces are in place there with respect to the sharing of information. We are working with the DHS on what we think are some barriers to the sharing of information. It has to do really with the classification of information by the government. As it was mentioned in my bio, I'm former Deputy Assistant Director of the Cyber Division of the FBI, so I'm very familiar with the classifications of information and the challenges of that, particularly in the cyber area. I am constantly challenging the government to take a look at information that it believes needs to be classified as cybersecurity information. A lot of the information that is obtained by the government is in many, many places on the internet, and whether or not a source is at risk, I think, is a challenging question that we continue to push to see if more information could be shared.
Thank you. Mrs. Stevens, let me talk to you about cyber incident reporting. You suggest in your testimony that the government consider requiring disclosure of cyber incidents, whether or not the incident resulted in a data breach or a system compromise. And I couldn't agree more, actually. So I've discussed this issue on more than once with respect to the transportation sector, and it's unfortunate to see the problem still remain. How would you hope that Tampa International Airport's ability to respond to cyber threats would improve if cyber reporting were mandatory across the sector? It's interesting how, in perimeter security, if a gate were opened and a vehicle drives onto the tarmac, even if nothing happened and the vehicle turns around and mistakenly, had gone onto the tarmac and turned around and left the perimeter, that would instantly be reported. But if there were to be a cyber intrusion, even if in digital terms, the perpetrator even made it way up to the plane or even put something on the plane, but nothing bad happened, I understand that incident wouldn't have to technically be reported in terms of cyber terms.
If it were a cyber incident, there's no mandate or requirement that I'm aware of that information would have to be reported. But what I would say, based on that comment that I made earlier about having a threshold, as the other witnesses have spoken, we don't want threat intelligence that just creates noise that's not actionable. But say, for instance, something happens at Orlando International, and there's a particular profile of a threat in the cyberspace that happens there. There is a lot of utility for other airports within the state or within the region or the country to be able to have real-time access to that information. So sharing that information becomes extremely valuable from that perspective. And the other thing that I would say, again, with respect to no requirement on the federal side that I'm aware of, interestingly enough, most of the states have some data breach reporting requirement through their AG's office. In the state of Florida, there are certain triggers that require you to report data breach, for example. And so I think that there at least needs to be some strong consideration given to how do we do this in a way where airports and airlines and key stakeholders are more encouraged and more inclined to share that information in real time, or as close to real time as possible.
Thank you. My time's expired. I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Troy, you spoke briefly in response to a question about the challenges of sharing information between the federal government and a variety of entities. And then, Mr. Porter, in your written testimony, you mentioned that the best defense against cyber espionage is the rapid sharing of information to all concerned parties. It seems that whenever we have hearings related to cyber, we all tend to land on or agree upon the idea that we need to do something to share information better. But because of the challenges you mentioned, we still haven't quite gotten there. And so beyond urging the federal government to be more discriminating with how it classifies information, and I share your sentiment as a former human intelligence officer, I share the sentiments you expressed. Are there, for the whole panel, are there other steps you think we could take to enhance that sharing, which I think we all agree is critical?
Well, that's really what the Aviation ISAC has been set up for. We are very active out there in promoting our mission and trying to continue to develop increased membership. As I mentioned, we pass information out to the government, and we also attend daily government meetings, both through DHS and TSA, to share with them critical information when we have that. I think the continued promotion of information sharing by the government and the continued successes that we're seeing from the membership that we have at this point in time is driving more people to end up sharing more information and trying to get through, I think sometimes that difficult decision of do I want to let people know that I've been mugged in the park, so to speak.
Yeah.
There still is a hesitancy for people to share information about attacks. And I personally believe that part of that is because of the potential for lawsuits that can come out of the sharing of information. And that is a unfortunate consequence because when you're trying to do the right thing to share information with other people, to have a lawsuit follow on as to whether or not due diligence was in place in the protection of your system is a real challenge.
Thank you. Mr. Porter? And no offense to your fellow panelists, but your tie is by far the best of the three.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So I guess when I think about information sharing, you're right. It's an easy platitude to say we should do more of it. But as some of the other panelists have noted, what the individual members of the aviation sector need is not more information, it's more relevant information. The primary value that the government is going to add is context. And they don't, obviously, some of that may be very classified and they can't share all of it, but much of the information is already going to be shared by private sector cybersecurity companies like mine anyway. What the government can do is give you extra context, extra specificity, perhaps based on secret information. That's also what they're most reluctant to share, and rightly so. That information obviously could endanger sources if shared. I guess my perspective is that also describes counterterrorism reporting prior to 9/11. We don't want to wait until after a major incident to say that it's worth the risk. So we should be honest and say that it would be a risk to share that kind of context-heavy information. It would be a very real risk, but that at this point that it's worth it because there's greater risk in not doing so.
Yeah.
I think, as I mentioned earlier in my comments, the fact that the fight is primarily in the private sector, not in government-owned networks, means that it's not going to endure as a lasting solution for our country to focus all of our national defense resources just defending national defense networks. You're going to have to push outward or it's not going to work. And that'll be a failure of inaction that it'll be difficult to assign blame, but there will still be victims for. So I think beforehand we should be proactive in saying we as a country understand the risk, it is a risk, and we're going to do it anyway. So.
Mr. Stevens, do you have anything to add?
Just simply this, I agree with Mr. Troy and Mr. Porter. I think the thing that the government could do to facilitate that so there could be more real-time and ready accessibility to threat intelligence, actionable, relevant threat intelligence, is perhaps creating a schema where at certain critical infrastructure entities such as airports, security clearances are granted to look at particular pieces of information. Right now, there may be threat intelligence out there that may be very good for airports to know, but again, the classifications become a problem sometimes, and getting access in a real-time manner becomes the main obstruction.
That's very helpful, and I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for all testifying today. I think, Mr. Troy, if I heard you correctly, you brought up that red teams are used. And so first, I want to confirm that my understanding of red teams are like the good guys that try to hack in to check for vulnerabilities. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Okay. I guess I'm trying to get an idea of what have you, or your industry, used red teams for? Have they tried to hack into the air traffic control system? Have they tried to hack into planes? And how do you balance? I assume it's difficult to balance actually hacking in because you might bring a whole system down. And you probably don't want to do that. So how do you really test if something can be hacked into or not without bringing the system down?
So the FAA runs the air traffic control system, and we have not tried to hack it. So I just want to make sure I get that. Our members use red teams on a regular basis. They give them full access. They allow them basically the ability to try and take down the systems, but not actual in-flight system. I mean, that obviously would be an issue. Do they do tests in flight? Yes, they do tests in flight, test flights, where they're doing work. But they conduct those systems. They use in-house employees, as well as they contract with specialists in the industry who hopefully come in with a different mindset and aren't used to the culture of the company that built it, so that they can challenge their thinking and their systems, and they conduct those red team exercises. But they're given full access to be able to actually find those vulnerabilities.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair and Mr. Stevens, you brought up an issue about the air traffic control system and possible vulnerabilities. And it seems, can you expand a little bit more? Because we're modernizing the air traffic control systems, which right now, I think I went on a tour and they pass like tapes or something like that to each other, which, you know, isn't very modernized. But I assume that one of the risks of modernizing is that then it's more hackable. Am I correct?
Yes, ma'am. That's the potentiality. Right now, as I referenced in my remarks, we're moving from a radar-based system, which is the current technology, even when I was a young air traffic controller, now to more a satellite-based technology with next-gen. And there's still system vulnerabilities with that. In fact, the DoD has pointed out its concerns with next-gen technology with respect to tracking military aircraft. So until we plug those vulnerabilities and fully understand, as the other panelists have said, we don't know what we don't know. There may be other things out there with the implementation of these systems that create problems for us. I think from an industrial control system standpoint, things like nav aids and airfield lighting and those types of things that are standard bread and butter operational types of structures on every airfield, particularly at every commercial airport, those are the things that present some risk, whether it's broad scale risk, as the witnesses have pointed out, there are redundant systems in place. But again, it only takes that one critical incident to really shock the psyche of the American traveling public, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I yield back my time.
Thank the gentlelady. And I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony and thank all of the members for their thoughtful questions today. The members of the subcommittees may have some additional questions for each of you, and if so, we will ask you all to respond in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for a period of 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittees stand adjourned.